So thank you for joining us for this bonus Q&A session about reading in the brain. After our webinar last week, we heard from numerous parents, educators, and healthcare professionals who are still asking important questions. Why does reading remain such a struggle for some? What do we do when tutoring and classroom support aren't enough? And how do we help a child who's losing their confidence or starting to believe they can't succeed as a reader? Today, we're creating space for those questions. This is a moderated session. Alan and I are going to walk through the themes that came up most often through the questions you shared last week and as you registered for today's session. So, from reading readiness to emotional regulation to what real progress can look like. So I'm pleased to welcome back Alan Heath. Alan is a sensory psychologist and the founder of Learning Solutions in the United Kingdom. He spent more than 25 years helping children with dyslexia, auditory processing challenges, and sensory integration needs move from frustration to confidence using therapeutic music, movement, and evidence-informed interventions. Alan trains professionals and supports families internationally in both clinical and home settings. He's also our international representative in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, and in the UAE. His work bridges clinical insight with everyday application in a way that is both practical but also deeply compassionate. Alan, we're grateful to have you with us again.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Alex. Lovely to be here again. Thank you.
So let's begin with one of the most important topics in today's session, and that's how the listening program supports reading and what families can realistically expect from their readers when using TLP. So, for a little background for those that aren't familiar with the listening program, it's a neuroscience-based music listening therapy. And through the use of carefully recorded classical and rhythmic world music, TLP engages the brain's auditory pathways and promotes brain plasticity, which means brain change. But this is more than just listening to music. It's about using sound in a very targeted therapeutic way to improve how the brain functions. The listening program is a powerful brain training method. It integrates high quality music, advanced neuroacoustic modifications, and personalized protocols that support lasting brain change. So, through the innovative frequency zone training, the ABC modular design, and specialized techniques, TLP engages multiple areas of the brain and really fosters holistic development. What truly sets the listening program apart is the real life impact and the ease of use, requiring only 15 minutes of listening per day, 5 days per week. Families and professionals have seen powerful outcomes, improvements in focus and communication, emotional balance, reading, and overall quality of life. Many describe feeling calmer, more connected, and better equipped to handle daily challenges, essentially to achieve homeostasis and have the flexibility in their emotional regulation in their nervous system to respond and adapt to what comes day to day. Scientific research continues to support the role of music in cognitive and emotional development for people of all ages across the lifespan. And studies continue to show how structured therapeutic music, like used in the listening program, enhances brain function in many areas such as memory, attention, regulation, and learning. So when it comes to reading, TLP plays a really unique role by strengthening the auditory and the sensory foundations that traditional methods often overlook or they don't touch. So, Alan, let's start with what we find families want to know first.
Mhm.
When someone starts using the listening program, when do we typically see the first signs of change? And I'm interested in this from your perspective, having been a provider for, well, about 25 years now.
Yes, yeah, and that's a really big question. Of course, in some ways the answer is, well, how long's a piece of string, as well. But I think from all the people that I've worked with over the years, it's very clear some children respond really, really quickly. I mean, within days. Um, and others it's more slow and steady over the weeks. Um, so I guess like any good bell curve, we've got that sort of idea that's what I see, that um, things that can happen very quickly are often not the things to do with reading,
Mhm.
but more the things, as you've mentioned already, and we'll probably get into later, more to do with what's happening in the nervous system and calming things down and organizing um, deeper sensory systems and things like that. So I think, yeah, definitely, a lot of the children I work with, sleep is something that can be impacted quite quickly within days and in the early weeks. Um, behavior, um, maturity as well. I get a lot of comments from parents, when I'm working with families who were saying, well, I can't really pin it down, but it's just like they're more connected in into the family and in the outside world. So it's that sense of, everything's a bit more grounded, a bit more organized, and therefore we begin to be able to pay attention better, which of course feeds into reading and listening, but it's also that sense of the emotional maturity moving forward and things like that as well. So,
Alan, what, is I hear you describing that, for me, what's really coming up is that the earlier changes that we see are more related to the sensory foundation
mm,
in the nervous system. So
yeah,
they're deeper in the nervous system, and they are what provide the support for higher level function, like
yes,
like attention, like memory, like reading.
yeah, and essentially, of course, that's the pyramid of learning that many people talk about, with that deeper sensory organization at the bottom end, allowing things to develop further up, as well, the reading and learning and things. Yeah.
Which tells us so many listeners are their system is ready for change. It just
Mm.
needed that opportunity, needed that right input, the right frequency, intensity, and duration, and that specific effort of doing the listening to begin to prompt the nervous system to shift.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So, how would you, explain, Alan, specific ways that TLP supports the brain systems involved in reading? So, really focusing on auditory processing, timing, and language. I'd love to delve into that.
Mm. Yeah, I think we talked about some of this last week, and I think we talked quite a bit about frequency perception, as well, and the mismatch negativity paradigm and things like this. So we've talked about some of that already, and essentially, if we think of sound as a moment in time with a gap, and then some more sound and a gap, then the way the brain processes sound, it's very clear that what we've got is, a need to process an onset of sound, and then the sound itself, and then the offset before the next sound. And so, of course, and again, as we said last week, we can't really pick apart pitch perception and volume perception and timing and spatial awareness and all these sorts of things, because they all happen together. But it's clear from all the research that all those elements, when you look at the research into dyslexia and poor readers, that poor readers don't have good pitch perception, they don't have good volume awareness, they don't have good beat competency and all these things. So it's really clear, in the research, that there's these underlying areas of auditory processing have not developed well enough. uh,
Mhm.
and therefore, if we can help train at a really fine level of pitch perception, but also the temporal processing side of, can we attend to a sound when it first begins before, we've lost it and then we're guessing what the word was because we missed the onset anyway. And it's clear again when we look at the neurology really of sound processing that there are multiple tonotopic maps
Yeah.
doing different things. So I think often when we think of processing sound, it's explained as well. There's a map in the brain that has all the frequencies, and all the sound goes there, and they're all there lined up like a piano keyboard, and sound is just processed. But it's much more complex, of course, and there's a lot not understood about it. But it seems to have some similarities with the visual system, where when we're looking at things, we've got different areas of the visual system picking up corners and edges and depth and color and shape and things like this. And there's multiple different areas in the auditory system that maybe are doing that. So I think yes, when we're looking at auditory processing, it's also not one system. Of course, it's essentially a multi-brain, multi-system activity that requires us to, yes, be able to understand a pitch and a changing pitch, but also to be able to process the harmonics or the overtones above sound. And this is something we didn't mention last week, so I think it's probably worth a quick mention that if we're listening to a sound that's say 200 hertz, so that's quite a low sound, then it's not just that sound that we need to process. We need to process all the other sounds in natural sound, which are at double that. So then the next overtone, if you like, would be 400 hertz, then 600, then 800, then 1000, as high as it would go. And the links between music and language there are very close as well. That if there are overtones in music, they are formants in terms of speech and reading. And again, the research shows clearly that, particularly with dyslexia, that processing those elements of sound that are not the fundamental sound itself are a challenge for people with dyslexia. So, music's a perfect way to retrain that because there's so many overlaps in the brain. So yes, that's the sort of a little bit on pitch perception again.
Well, it's interesting because really what you're describing, Alan, is that music from human voice, let's focus on non-human voice, other non-human voiced instruments,
Mm,
the strings, the woodwinds, the world instruments that are used in the listening program and in time, that the music is an analog to spoken language into heard language. And it's an analog in that every instrument has a unique voice. It has fundamental frequencies. It has the overtones within that. And it's the interplay of the instruments together, the rhythm, the timing, the pitch perception,
yeah.
the melody, the beat, the tempo. All of these components are simply through the act of listening and putting on the headphones and
Mm,
experiencing that music. We're providing the brain the opportunity, the stimulus to activate and train the neural networks responsible for auditory processing and reading without directly working on reading.
yes.
We're providing input, 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 input without a required expressive output in order to get the benefit.
Yes. And I've always thought that's the beauty of it. And I still remember when I first did the training course 25 years ago, whatever it was, the focus on we use natural instruments
Yes.
in the listening program because every single time that violin bows, it produces a slightly different sound. and a different quality. And of course, that's somewhat similar to voices again, so compared to anything that might be played on a synthesizer, which is the same every time, even, from the very basics of using these instruments um, in a way where it's all live instrumentation. The thought that went behind the listening program, obviously you know that better than me, but that's what always struck me and has always stayed with me for years. The quality of sound and the recording quality, of course, that gives us gaps cleaner in sound, and how that, yes, this is all good quality listening training, and that underpins the ability to read, even if we're just reading in our head, of course, never mind reading out loud.
Yeah.
And
Well,
these,
and I think one other point to build on that idea, Alan, is the fact that the listening program is unique in that it is beautiful. It is engaging, it is activating, and in the same moment, calming, that we are intrinsically motivated to put on the headphones and have the experience of the listening program because it is, in fact, beautiful music.
yes,
And I think too often we miss that point. There are so many listening therapies that are um, they are to be tolerated as opposed to enjoyed.
yes. And I often find as well when I first speak to parents, one of the concerns they may have is, well, will my child engage with this and listen? And over so many years, I've had that question, and my answer very much now is very, very likely.
Yeah.
It's unlikely they won't, because in some ways it's not like listening to classical music anyway, or world music, because of the quality of it, the movement of the instruments and everything that's going on in there adds to the fact that this isn't just music that they're listening to anyway. There's lots of auditory events, nature sounds, whatever it might be in the different programs that keep attention. And I've always found that even young children, 2, 3 years old, are
Mhm.
more likely to want to listen more than listen less
Yeah,
with it. So
for
it's
sure.
that's a lovely thing as well.
Yeah, especially with the attention of a young child, and of course, other activities can be done with listening, so the child can be engaged in something and let the listening happen, or be immersed and fully present with it. And we have that flexibility. So Alan, a lot of families and providers are using other interventions.
Mm.
So maybe you could just speak a little bit about how the listening program can be paired with um, reading instruction, tutoring, speech therapy, school-based programs. Maybe just speak about how it can stack and support other interventions that are directed toward supporting the developing reader.
Yeah, for me, I think with whether it's any sort of reading intervention or speech and language therapy, or any other learning intervention around reading, um, as we've already said, this is the listening program is so fundamental, um, and it's not just looking at improving reading. And I think that's where I always go with it, that the key is, yes, it can help with the basics of reading, but because it will also calm the system and help things emotionally and help organize sensory systems and help with laterality and things like this, then for me it's always the start point.
Mm,
Um, and obviously I work with movement as well, and I know some people in the UK who work with primitive reflexes, they would say, oh, well, we do primitive reflex work first, and then we do the listening program. And I think that's just a, a preference and and a bias that we all have.
mhm.
But yes, in terms of any additional program, I think they can run alongside, absolutely. And sometimes in schools, the intervention is going to happen anyway. It's
Right.
just that if we can put the listening program in alongside, it will smooth the path of a reading program or phonics or whatever else it might be. Because, yes, not only we're helping with the auditory processing side of things, as we've talked about, but if we're calming the system as well, then it's easier to engage with things. So it's that sense as well of, this is a more holistic program that we're looking at.
Right, and we talk about proceeding. That can be looked at in two ways. It can be complete a course of the listening program before those interventions, or pair them. And before we engage in a session, speech therapy session, a reading session, we use the listening program as a primer before
Yes,
we engage in that work to get the child present, focused, centered, but then also attuned to the frequency that's going to
absolutely.
be involved in that instruction.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think this is why where it's used in schools as well. A question often is what time of day should we do it? And often, you know, doing it in the morning, first
Mhm.
thing, will prime the system ready for learning and concentration and attention. So yeah,
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 absolutely.
absolutely.
And for us before we sit down and work.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, first thing in the morning. Yeah, yeah.
So having been 27 years in the listening program now as a listener, I'll take breaks on occasion,
Hmm.
and sometimes on a long occasion. And I've come back very recently in recent months to, a morning ritual of the listening program and in time is I'm starting my day. And it's interesting after all these years of listening and being at this stage of life, it's providing me uh, new awareness, new grounding, new attention, higher executive functioning performance, and really help regulating my circadian cycle and supporting sleep again. So it's
Yeah.
fun right now to be rediscovering. And for those providers that are here with us, if it's been a while since you put on your headphones, I can't encourage you more to pull out the
Uh,
headphones and start a schedule again.
yeah, me too. I couldn't agree more in general terms. Last time I did an achieve run through, I was surprised at how I wasn't really expecting a great deal,
Yep.
but actually my improved listening and attention and speed of processing and ability to listen to what somebody was saying whilst sort of in the background, thinking of a response and the speed and organization of that response being much better. So of course, yeah, we can all improve listening and things all the time, can't we?
Yeah. Yeah,
Absolutely.
always room for change. So, we've looked quite a bit, Alan, at, how the listening program supports brain function and reading. Maybe let's zoom out a little bit to a bigger question that we're seeing come up during our live event last week and the submissions that we had for today. What's really going on when a child is trying, but they're still not progressing? That's, I think, the big question is understanding this reading struggle. So when you meet a child, Alan, who's struggling to read, especially one who's already received support, right? They're in reading
Mm,
intervention, but the needle's not moving.
yeah.
What do you start looking for maybe beneath that surface and neurologically, behaviorally that others might have missed? Where do we go?
Yeah, I think obviously it depends what you have available in a way.
Yeah.
Um, that so yes, there's the auditory processing side that we've already talked about. That's quite key. If we've got the ability to actually be able to check out things like auditory figure ground and closure and some of those things, we can get a clear auditory picture of what's going on. Um, if we look at the other areas, Then of course we we know as well that things like the visual system is obviously really important in reading. So this is how well are the two eyes working together? Can they fixate on a point and then move to the distance and all that sort of thing? Um, how well are the two sides of the brain and body integrated as
Hmm.
well? Because that will affect reading. Uh,
Hmm.
so we can see these things pop up more readily maybe in the body than in the ears sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, so I think yes, certainly looking at laterality
Hmm.
it can be really important. So
So meaning we can simply look at how a child moves and
yes,
some clue to the motor organization, right? That
yeah,
foundational, that foundation in the brain that supports reading, simply the clean cross pattern movement, the fluidity of movement, the ability to move and flow, without thinking about that movement. That's a great indicator right there.
yes, and of course if we can move and do something else at the same time, especially if it's any sort of cross pattern movement, then of course that's telling us that the movement is in flow, it's automatic. If we can answer a question while we're doing some cross pattern movement,
Sure.
and that will tell us a lot
Yeah.
as well. So I think yeah, those things are huge. And you're right. I have a lot of um, families now will send me little videos of their children just walking or running, and you can see that flow that's so important. Uh, yeah.
Well, and maybe two, practical tools, for our providers and for the parents. Advanced Brain Technology provides a client history form that can be completed. And that client history tells us a lot about what's going on presently, but what also happened developmentally. So for a provider to review that listening intake is a great base. Second, our listening checklist is going to uncover a lot of areas for us to then delve into more deeply. So just keep in mind that we have these tools that parents can provide us information before we even meet or see this child that begin to give us some direction to understand part of the picture that's going on. So I
Mm,
just don't want to lose sight of the importance of that. And earlier, when you were talking about, all the discrete skills of auditory processing and how listening to the listening program can support that, I think it's helpful to know that there are assessments like the Scan 3 that practitioners can use to look at skill and deficit areas in auditory processing. And we know through the research that the listening program, in fact, improves these areas of performance. So if we see
mm,
specific deficits in areas of auditory processing, we have
mm,
published research that shows how the listening program produces those changes. So we can look at, a finer grained picture of what's going on in the system and know TLP is going to help support many of those areas.
yeah. Again, I couldn't agree more. And the research shows clearly that things like, um, from Nina Kraus, the noise affects neural processing for poor readers more than good readers. And that's clear when you do something like the Scan 3, the auditory figure ground, as it's called, this listening in background noise, that poor readers have difficulty with listening in background noise. Um, and I can say as well clearly, as does the research, with many years of using Scan 3 and TLP, it's really quite clear that we can take somebody from the first centile on figure ground skills, listening in background noise, up into normal ranges within 3 to 6 months or something, if and that's huge.
Well, it's huge because
The
those
kids
aren't
will
areas
benefit.
that magically change with development,
Yeah, yes,
right?
absolutely.
They will stay stuck in most
Mm,
cases.
yeah.
You know,
Mm.
did you have another comment on that, Alan?
Yes, I was just going to say if anybody does know Scan 3 or uses it or anything, one of the other big areas is essentially what's called dichotic listening testing,
Mhm.
where in the testing we've got the headphones on and we're hearing, say, one word in this ear and a different word simultaneously in this ear. And I think that type of testing is fascinating as well in terms of auditory processing, because it begins to give us information about what's happening with both ears and both sides of the brain.
Yeah.
And of course, about 80%, I think, of the information going in the right ear goes to the left side of the brain for processing initially, 80% from the left going to the right. And there's a pretty clear pattern often with poor readers and dyslexia where um, you know we can hear things in the right ear, but we can't really hear anything in the left ear in that sort of testing. So you'll often get a huge bias towards the right ear, and they can pick words out in the right ear and sentences, but they're not in the left ear. It's
Yeah.
just not really functioning almost in terms of processing terms for sentences. And I think that tells us a lot about the bigger system of neurology that we wouldn't necessarily maybe consider when we're reading, but looking at how the two sides of the brain are doing the different things to get us to comprehension of what we're reading. Um, so it's yeah, if the left side of the brain is focused more on, well, in terms of phonemes, things like p, t, k, b, the left hemisphere is more adept at processing those, where if we think of longer vowel sounds at a slightly lower frequency, there's not so much of a bias, and that starts to give us clues about what the left and right brain are doing in terms of processing language. But clearly, we need both working together.
Yeah, I mean it's a whole brain function from the
Yeah.
brain stem to the cortex
Ah,
and back,
yes.
right? So it's a very complex dance that's taking place in order to listen, discriminate, read, decode, comprehend as a reader. And just to clarify, and I think you said it very well, is when you mention one ear's hearing or not hearing, what we're really talking about is hearing can be perfect, hearing
Oh,
acuity.
of
It's the
course.
listening and the brain, what the brain's doing with what it's hearing,
Mm,
where we're doing the work as opposed to on the hearing itself.
absolutely.
So, often we see that kids can decode, right? So they can do the decoding, but they don't comprehend
Mm.
the reading. So what do you see as that chasm between the two?
I think that's very much again about maybe about integration of the two sides of the brain is
Yeah.
certainly one thing. As we've already said, we might see this in terms of how they move and how the two sides of the body are integrated as well. That they can do, in simplistic terms, I suppose, the right ear to left brain task of decoding.
Hmm.
But when it's putting things together, which involves more complex understanding and an overview, so we want both hemispheres involved, that's just not able to happen. So I often see that, if I am doing auditory testing as well, we'll see that difference between the right and left hemisphere and the right and left ear, but you can see it in the body as well, such that cross-lateral movement is either at best very conscious or otherwise, we can't really, do a cross crawl as it would be in brain gym, lifting one leg and crossing the arm over the other side and things like that fluently again. So
And I think another component higher in the nervous system is auditory working memory, because
yeah.
we have to be able to decode, but then hold those pieces together, understand them, process, and do something with them. So if
Yeah.
auditory working memory is deficit,
Mm,
we're still going to have this gap. And that's another area that the listening program can help support, and other, specific uh, training tools like the Simply Smarter software program that will train auditory and visual working memory. And because that's where the comprehension comes into place. So
Yes.
and that's a higher level function.
Yeah.
Once we have that foundation, then we need to build on too.
Oh, yeah. I must say though as well, the way the listening program plays around with that, because obviously if we've got a sequence of music and then we can repeat the sequence of music,
Yeah,
then we can turn it around the other way, then we can repeat it but miss a note out. We're back to the mismatch negativity that we were talking about last week, but what that's doing is helping the brain to anticipate what's coming next.
that's right.
It's training that, but it's also then training the ability to notice when something's not there. And a lot of that subtlety in the program would be missed, I think, by any listener. But it's built into it from the start, and that's really quite unique.
Yeah. It is, so this, really brings together, I think, why supporting reading is so much more than drilling phonics, right? What we
Yeah.
understand is happening. Story looks very different when we look at all the multiple systems,
Mm,
how the hierarchy builds on itself, how a deficit lower in the system creates a deficit higher in the system. So we
yeah.
have to look holistically at the individual.
Yeah.
And I think that still is the missing piece in most approaches to reading. So we're not
Yes.
looking at the whole child.
Well, naturally, as most education systems and health systems are reductively based anyway, so it's going back out to a more global view, isn't it? Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
shifting out more globally, and we've talked about this foundation, but I want to go further. So as we, let's shift now to physical and sensory systems that support reading. One of the most commonly overlooked areas, as we've just touched on. So
Mm,
let's talk about vision a little bit, Alan. How
mm,
do visual perception and visual processing influence reading? I think we think about the eyes more than we think about the ears
yeah.
with reading, right? Because reading is an act of using visual translation to sound, right, in order
Mhm.
to understand what it is that we're
Yeah.
looking at on the
Yeah.
page. So, visual perception, visual processing in reading. How do we look at that as different from just simply a simple eye test and checking a child's eyesight? So, where I'm really getting is, when a child looks at an eye chart, they have 20/20 vision, right? But can there still be something going on in the visual processing system that's affecting their ability to read?
Hugely, of course, and this is akin to having a hearing test and somebody having perfect hearing and just saying, well, that's fine. We don't need to think of anything else in the auditory system. And the same with vision, of course, because that 20/20 vision doesn't tell us, as we've talked about with laterality for a start, how well are the two eyes working together? Are they able to focus on a page? Can they do pursuit movements, left to right, right to left? And
Urge?
yes, and I think this begins then to get us into the area of letter reversals and things like that as well. That when we think of how can we see a B as a D, and how can we read it as a B, B as a D, or we see the word was and read it as saw or whatever else it might be, and that begins, I think, as a visual system. Um, and I always give the example of if you think of B and D and P and Q, then they're actually the same letter if you look at them three-dimensionally.
Hmm.
But of course, they are two-dimensional on the page. And we grow up in this world when we're little, which is essentially a three-dimensional world. If we're looking at a chair, it's a chair. Even if you walk behind it, it's still a chair. Or if you lie on the floor, it's still a chair. But of course, when you get to B's and D's and P's and Q's, if you walk round a B, then it's a D. Or if you look at it upside down, it's a P or a Q. And so we're moving from a three-dimensional visual world into a two-dimensional flat world for reading. And I think that gets us into whole other areas of how well the vestibular system is functioning, which is, that three-dimensional gyroscope that needs to be fixed and processing well and has massive connections into the eyes in terms of eye movements anyway, and fixation and moving your head. So I think there's a whole big area there, where, yes, there are lots of visual things. Again, these are things that we can see developmentally with children. If they're reversing letters and numbers, then we've got to be looking at laterality,
Hmm.
and we've got to be considering the vestibular system. We've got to be considering as well whether there's retained primitive reflexes. If any of you know about primitive reflexes, then things like the asymmetric tonic neck reflex that's about sidedness,
Hmm.
then things like that can clearly lead in and affect reading as well. So yeah, there's all these systems underneath, that actually, to come back to it, the listening program, particularly with bone conduction, absolutely helps with integrating primitive reflexes. And that's, I can see we're running out of time, but we've not got into the nervous system and the moro reflex and all these sorts of things, but low frequency sound and the listening program helps integrate those areas as well. So I think this is a big part of this global thing that it can get to.
Right, the sensory motor system, that foundational support for the higher level systems again.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we are closing in on time.
Yeah.
This time, these conversations move quickly, Alan.
Yes.
Something that might be the most emotionally charged with a struggling reader is motivation, frustration. How do we respond when a child starts to believe they just can't read? The goal for me is how do we take a non-reader to being an individual that loves to read
I
and what
think,
that unlocks in their world for them?
yes. And I think as well, we can look at it in terms of reading. And again, I almost can't answer that, without going wider, because if somebody very much dislikes reading, surely the worst thing we can do is have them do more reading, because that's just going to embed the dislike. Um, so if we take a step back from that, then everything we've talked about, which is, okay, let's retrain the auditory system for a start so they can begin to read and they can begin to understand phonological awareness and things like that. Um, so I think something I said last week as well was, well, in an ideal world, we wouldn't be asking them to read. We'd read to them and have a book there so they can sort of track along and look at a picture or just follow the words. So there's no pressure on there. Because I think the other side of that is that obviously for somebody who finds reading difficult, you probably just have to get a book out, and the stress is building and things anyway. So that's not a place we can start reading from. So we have to step back a bit, just read to them. Of course, find things they're interested in
Yep. High,
that you
high
can read
interest,
to them.
the highest interest topics possible. And the other thing
Absolutely.
is for them to listen to audiobooks, right?
Yes.
So we kind of listening to audiobooks, so do a session at TLP, listen to
Yeah.
audiobooks with super high interest information.
Yeah.
Because once we connect with that child with something that's interesting to them, then their horizon begins to
Yeah.
expand and they become more engaged.
Yeah.
John, Alan, for those that have joined us today, any final thoughts or words that you'd wish to share, on today's topic?
Oh, I think in terms of reading, it's such a hugely important area because it's not just about the reading. It's actually, as we said, it's about what's underneath that. It's the auditory processing, it's the organization of the system, it's laterality, it's integrated primitive reflexes, it's good vestibular function. So again, I think the reading part of it, I can think of so many children I've worked with. Um, One who I'll just mention, she actually started TLP, she was fifth grade, so 11 in the US, started TLP spectrum actually, but on the testing before, all her literacy testing was below average. This is why I've thought of it, because she's somebody who really didn't like reading and was avoiding it, and it was becoming a real problem. So this was August 24. By November, she was diving into books. And I remember talking to a dad actually who was saying, they were really excited because she'd read either a biography or autobiography on Simone Biles and been asked to,
Mm.
one of the class topics was to write a 750 word biography. She did 1,500 words. Um, but by the time she was tested this summer, she was on the 97th centile for,
Mm.
for reading and writing. So I'm told that's equivalent to 11th grade, 16, 17 years old. Um, and it's that, yes, reading's great, but that for me, to help somebody get that interest and that explosion in reading, still, yes, listening's great, screens are great, all those things, but the way reading fires creativity and imagination, I think it still has a part to play. And it's yes, yeah,
Well, reading helps us understand our world in so many ways and
mm,
helps us understand there's something beneath the immediate, beyond the immediate environment that we're in, and really unlocks our ability to do anything we want to do in life,
I
right?
just
Because we have this free will and this ability to learn and all this rich information that we can consume. We just need the ability to access it. And that's what we're really talking about, why reading is so important to so many
yeah,
people.
a really quick example of that. I've just remembered I was working with a lady in her 50s last year, the year before, who was dyslexic. She'd had to give a job up as a nurse because she found it so difficult with the reading side of things and the stress of that. Um, and they she's actually now in radiography again. She's back working, but one of the things she said to me was she was driving down the motorway. She's in England. She was driving down the motorway and she read signs for the junctions, and she was absolutely overjoyed on one of the calls where she was saying, I actually read the sign and I understood it, so I knew when to turn off. And it's like, so it's, yeah, reading is still very much about life, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it
Huge. Yeah.
certainly is.
Mm.
Alan, thank you for these last couple stories, examples, really, I think,
Oh,
ground this conversation. And thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us again for this bonus Q&A session. And everyone that joined us, thank you. We hope you're leaving with some new insights and some practical next steps that you can use to help children and families in your life. If you want to learn more about the listening program or speak with our team, visit advancedbrain.com or call us at country code 1-801-622-5676 or email info@advancedbrain.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Advanced Brain Technologies. If you are in the UK, if you're in Ireland or the UAE and you want more information on the listening program, interested in working with Alan, connect with Alan at learning-solutions.com learning-solutions.co.uk or email info@learning-solutions.co.uk. Everyone, thank you for joining us for today's session, and make it a great day.